Here we are again, this time to talk about being social justice warriors.
Oh no.
You know, it's kind of interesting to me how that term went from being like in the 90s, early 2000s, from being sort of a positive or even a neutral term, you see it in news reports, to now it's a pejorative mostly. But we should talk about this in terms of where the Bruderhof lands in the sphere of taking to the streets, civil disobedience, protests, and so forth. And I should begin by saying that as a community, we're far from being monolithic on this question. Like anywhere, people feel differently as to where, when, and how to register dissent with the status quo. But I think everyone would agree that as Christians, we have an obligation to stand with the poor and the less powerful. So rather than talk generally, we might be better off reflecting on our own experiences growing up within the Bruderhof, because we're like, what, a decade apart? So we have a different worldview maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I never did much marching or civil protests. I think I'm more of a grassroots type of campaigner myself, like protesting small and very localized thing, like whether my dog could sleep in the house or not. I remember campaigning my mother saying that I was going to live outside as well. Or I remember like part of our education was trying to learn empathy or at least sympathy for people that were less fortunate. Like we did a project sleeping outside or kind of trying to put ourselves in a homeless person's set of circumstances without shelter or security for the night. And that was very interesting. But I know that you have quite the history of activism, and I'd be really curious if you'd be willing to share some of that today.
Well, I mean, it was really a product of the time I grew up in. So like in the late 80s, there was a lot of concern with the farm workers in California and the West Coast. And I remember we had Cesar Chavez, who founded the National Farm Workers Association, along with Dolores Huerta. They visited for a conference, and it was remarkable to hear about the work they were doing to organize the farm workers. And then also as a young kid, I remember Vincent Harding visiting with his wife, Rosemary. They spent time with our class, and he was just a really great guy with kids. He taught us civil rights songs and so forth, and only came to find out later what a revolutionary figure he had been in the civil rights movement. Actually, being the guy who wrote Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech, which was pretty radical and called out capitalism and greed as being what was causing injustice. Then you go a little further on. I just remember when the first Gulf War happened. I must have been in elementary school, and we were very concerned as kids about peace, and we made this peace program, and very childlike, and went from school to school, public schools, colleges, churches around our area, trying to get signatures to end the Gulf War. Then later on, the Bruderhof got involved a lot in the anti-death penalty movement, which was a big deal during Clinton's, tough on crime initiative in the mid-90s. And there was a lot of support for the death penalty. And as kids, we were really encouraged to think about the humanity of these people who, had done horrible things, and yet were still human beings made in the image of God, and reverence for life really extended to them as well. And then late 90s, going to high school, became very aware of police brutality, particularly through the cases of like the shooting of Amadou Diallo, and then earlier than that, the Rodney King beating in LA. And that got me inspired, along with other students from the Bruderhof, and then also within our local high school, to organize, action days, walkouts and protests. And then also like teaching days. We did some teaching, very, again, quite naive and in some ways uninformed, but our hearts really were, with those who were, at the bottom. So that was my experience, as a kid growing up in the Bruderhof, late 80s and into the 90s. So you came after that.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I remember hearing about a lot of those initiatives and some of the more colorful stories and consequences, but it does sound amazing, and I think it really makes a great point about how our church has sought to be an active part in decrying injustices and really standing up and making a racket if there is something worth protesting. And I think that's because God wants us to address not only spiritual bondage, where people find themselves in situations like that, but also where there is physical bondage and oppression. And it also brings to mind stories that I would hear from my grandfather about marching with Dr. King or protesting the various conflicts in the Middle East, like you were talking about, protesting the wars. And of course, I kind of came at the end of the death penalty era, I guess you could say.
Right.
So I do recall that, and I think it's very valuable to reflect on that and think about how we can apply that to what's happening today.
Right, and those, I look back and those were valuable experiences, and I'm very grateful to my parents and the community I grew up in for exposing us to the struggles other people deal with. It's important to put a face on the wretched of the earth. And I don't really regret any of it, although some parts looking back are maybe a little cringeworthy. But my experience has been that this kind of activity can sometimes, again looking back, it can sometimes be performative and even self-righteous. As a young kid, sometimes you think you know better than everybody else, and you don't stop to think how others may view a situation.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point because, does that actually affect change? And can that kind of come away from what you're actually trying to focus on, which is the injustice, when it becomes about yourself and less about the need? So maybe the litmus test here is whether our intentions and our actions flow from a sense of charity rather than personal ambition or gain. And I just think it's not right as Christians to selfishly ignore the plight of our neighbors. That's just completely contravenes God's commands. And actually, Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, talks about the importance of protesting unjust laws. And he quotes Augustine. He says, "An unjust law is no law at all." He also talks about the church, which all believers are a part of. And he talks about the church being a thermostat, not a thermometer, which is very interesting. And I think he means that we shouldn't just register what's going on in the world around us, but actually be agents of change. And that can take place through protest, but it can also take place through those small deeds of love. So we are to be the voices of conscience that challenge injustice and not just affirm the status quo.
Right. And protest is one way to do it. And then also, in this country, we can contact our elected representatives. We can vote if that's something we feel. And we can also work locally in our local communities. But as we talked about previously, that kind of action that we're talking about, it requires sacrifice, and it requires actually living lives that embody social justice. So, your strident rants on Facebook, I think, often really only harden division, as cathartic as they may be.
Are you speaking generally, or like my strident rants on Facebook?
Are you on Facebook?
No. But yeah, I think it's very tempting, especially like in the virtual world, to just vent and react when we're upset about something, whether it stems from injustice or not. But I think that's mostly pretty self-indulgent and rarely results in any effective change. To me, the best example is someone like Mother Teresa, who had tremendous humility, but also made a huge impact with just every loving deed or initiative that she took on. She really put her whole heart into it. And I do wonder, though, thinking about someone who really was a saint like Mother Teresa, did she ever lose her temper? Did she ever lose her cool?
I don't know. You know, there's that one viral clip going around. This is not Mother Teresa, but Pope Francis. This woman in the greeting line tries to grab his hand, and you know, and he just and like shouts at her. So you know, I think she probably did. Yeah. Even the most saintly people.
I'm also thinking about John Perkins, who is really a civil rights icon, and he's been a wonderful friend to the Bruderhof. He talked about what he calls the 3 R's. Are you familiar with that? Mm-hmm. So that's redistribution, relocation, and reconciliation. And each of those things involves us laying something down that's hard to do. Our wealth, our sense of place, and our grudges and resentments. But I think each of those things is key. It seems to me that the Bible and the people of God have an overwhelming concern for justice, because God really has an overwhelming concern for justice. And I think because of that, he insists that justice must be remembered. So that being said, justice and righteousness, to me, they really go hand in hand, and they're connected, because if we uphold and promote the absolute truth and authority of the Scripture, our fight against injustice won't be about like secular self-concern. It will really be about the evils in the world. Mm-hmm.
More of a communal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, and how this work looks is going to look different for different people. Looking back at the 3 R's that John Perkins talks about. Before I was married, I tried the relocation thing, and I moved with some other young folks into an abandoned house in Camden, New Jersey, which is a very poor area and violent area. And it was a good experience, and it opened my eyes to how difficult it is for people to extract themselves from poverty and from also destructive and sinful lifestyles. Like you say, you know, justice and righteousness do go hand in hand. Now, we eventually left Camden, but there are still young people who moved there around the same time as us who continue there. They're not part of the Bruderhof, just there are other young people we met. And they're still living there, whatever it is, 12, 13 years later, and they're raising their families there and just being part of the neighborhood and working to improve the schools primarily. And they're not there as do-gooders because they've been there so long, but they're just there as neighbors in an area that's, you know, not home for them, but they've made it their home. And I think that's a beautiful thing, and I have great respect for that.
So they're not doing it for the praise or the applause.
Right, they're not doing it to you know, to boost their resume or like have something impressive to put on their college application. They're, you know, they've been there and they have no plans of leaving. And you know, that crossing barriers in that way, you know, getting out of our comfort zone is important.
Totally agree.
But you know, on the other hand, I think of the beginnings of our community. The founders of our community who lived in a city, who lived in a, you know, Berlin in the Weimar era, which is morally dissolute and a lot of injustice, a lot of poverty. And they were reading the Sermon on the Mount, and you know, they could have said, we're going to try to do this within the city and among the poor, but they said, you know what, we need to actually put this stuff into practice, and the way to do that is to get out of the city, move into the country, get in touch with the land, you know, do physical manual work on the land, and try to live a life of brotherhood. So that's another way to do it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that actually a lot, Rich, because I feel like right now there is so many dissatisfied people and people that are uncomfortable in their circumstances, and really like, what do you do to remedy the injustices in the world? Like, you have to take some sort of action, and protesting shrilly is not always the way to go about it, but like actually being the change that you want to see. It's a total cliche, but there is a foundation there, and our own history illustrates that. And I think like also our own history is really surrounded by global conflict, if you will, and the community opposed that actually very vocally, not in form of protest necessarily, but by really taking on the leaders of the time and directly challenging them.
Right.
So,
which we should still be doing today.
Yes, for sure.
And you know, if you want to be part of this, the way we're doing it, of really trying to live out the Sermon on the Mount and be obedient to Jesus' teachings of living in social, economic, and relational justice. We're actually expanding right now. The Bruderhof is expanding. We're starting new communities on the West Coast, down south further, and we're looking for co-workers. So if you feel called to that, you should obviously get in touch with us. Otherwise, you can just keep watching our videos here on the YouTube and encouraging us with your comments. So thanks for watching, and have a great day.